Hello there, welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel, show where we dive into weird, peculiar, unusual and generally different types of music. Today I'm wearing my little face mask of my cat here today. I just thought it'd be a bit fun. I'd like to think that I'm kind of into, a wide range of different bands and artists, and I really enjoy using this platform as a way to show off, some of my favourite records of all time, basically, from all sorts of different genres. So in today's episode, we're going to be looking at what is one of my favourite bands out there, and also finally returning to Rocket Recordings, which we recovered on our video Alma Matters. So today we have a band who, they've got this incredibly eclectic and diverse discography that covers such a wide range of genres and styles, yet all tied into this very cohesive sort of, psychedelic noise experience, if that makes sense. And we're going to be looking at what is arguably one of my favourite albums from this group, the amazing 26th album, Mirror by Gnod. Look, it actually acts as a mirror. How crazy is that? So, let's ask ourselves, who are Gnod? To put it briefly somewhat, Gnod are this British collective from Salford, Manchester, formed in 2006, and featuring an ever-shifting, changing lineup of members. And across their career, Gnod have pushed out album after album after album, exploring so many facets of experimental music under the moniker of Gnod. And also under varying Gnod spin-offs, through solo adventures, collaborative albums, even through their own record label Tesla tapes. And to try consolidate every single release connected to the group, it would be a minefield to navigate. There's so much that they've all done and created across their career. And as it is actually, the very album we're looking at today, it's sort of seen as somewhat of a departure from what they'd been establishing at the time. They were sort of doing these very abstract, sort of psychedelic droning rock experiences, if that makes sense. It's also very diverse anyway. And then this album, The Mirror, it saw Gnod indulging in truly ferocious noise rock, pummeling us with riffs and double bass and motoric drums that it's so incredibly intimidating, yet it's a phenomenal album experience. So let's just dive right into it then, shall we? The Mirror opens up with the phenomenal opening track, The Mirror. And it's a nearly 8-minute piece that, it abrasively introduces itself with this sudden attack of drums and bass before this really weird yet, indulgent groove starts to push everything along. And it's also incredibly satisfying, as we're given this really existential musing on the many faces seen deep within the mirror. It's a very peculiar track though, especially with that drum and bass sort of pushing it all along. It's got this, motoric groove to it, but it all seems so weirdly staggered, especially when you get the stabs of guitar that come into it all, or the very peculiar effects that are just happening in the background. It gives you this real sense of being really out of place and time, and so existential. And as well though, I love the refrain that I feel like acts as a chorus, which is howled out by Paddy Shine, of him just going, break out, break out. It's such a, he howls it with such disdain and anguish. I can't do it justice, and I'm not going to try. And it makes it all sound so miserable yet satisfying to listen to. So existential, but so brilliant. And it's it makes the whole track so satisfying, especially after the 5.5-minute mark, when the build up into that very prominent riff of the actual album itself. I feel they kind of change it up a bit, but it's this sort of time motif, I would argue. We'll get into it a bit more later. But it climbs up and up, and you get this really confusing swirling miasma of pummeling noise. And so it's a brilliant way to open up the album itself, but I have to say I really enjoy what the album itself then does with continuing the very notions and ideas explored in the rest of the tracks available. So, the mirror then continues on into its second track. We get the next track, Learn to Forgive, which is perhaps one of the most satisfying and brutal tracks in the whole of Gnod's discography. This is arguably a track that's so reminiscent of that pummeling assault we've seen from the early days of Swans, where you get that rhythmic, motoric bass and drums that push everything along, whilst the guitars are just screeching and whining over the top with this really discordant fuzz, And as well, this one has a really satisfying guitar part that climbs up and down, going like, oh man, I love how that thing sounds. It's so brilliant, and it's also confusing and dizzying. It really puts you into this peculiar state of mind, And then, this one as well though, it really wants it to be turned up louder and louder though, so you can let those noisy dirges completely overtake you and swallow you up whole. And lyrically though, this one feels like such an assault of misery and anguish. We're given lines like, sick of this place, fucking sick of this place, which it then as you get into the sort of latter half of the song, especially its outros and stuff, you get the refrain of, what happens when all of your dreams turn into your worst nightmares? For me, it feels kind of like a commentary that kind of implies to me the shifting and turning of everything, from something, good you see in the world turning into something ugly and abhorrent. Just no longer to able to stand being there anymore. You start hating everything around you and just existence itself, I feel, if that makes any sense. But yeah, going back to it though, the pummeling continues on this track. It just climbs up towards this really noisy, indulgent, extended outro where the bass continues the riff and the guitars just climb into this frenzy of discordant drones, sounding like it's all spinning down the plug hole basically, going further and further deeper into that miserable abyss. Man, what a satisfying track though, it's such a monumental dirge of phenomenal proportions. However, there's actually one more track to this album. 3 tracks. This is a very short album experience, but 3 tracks is all this album needs. And if we thought the first 2 tracks were brilliant existential dirges, I would argue they're nothing compared to the colossal 8-minute closing track of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I'll be honest. Gnod have so many phenomenal songs out there. So many brilliant tracks that people love and adore. But Sodom and Gomorrah, it's easily one of my favorite compositions by Gnod in that entire discography. It's a brutal, droning dirge that bombards you with this sort of existential, quasi-religious musing that takes elements from. It's actually takes elements from a track from their previous 2015 album, Infinity Machines. Most notably, some of the lyrics from the album's 6th track, Spinal Fluid. And both tracks even open up with the same quote of, escape is now deafening. At least I think that's what it says. I have struggled to find the lyrics for, Gnod songs, I guess, which is a bit of a shame, but I'm pretty sure that's what he's saying. Both Spinal Fluid and Sodom and Gomorrah open up with that sort of same thing. It's brilliant, though. Whilst Spinal Fluid, though, it's uses that opening and slowly stretches out towards these really abstract drones like what you get on a lot of that album. Sodom and Gomorrah though, opens up with that. You get these really sort of very peculiar drones that kind of what you'd hear on Later's album and stuff. And then you get the vocal opening and then bam, back into the riff, back into the bass and the drums, except this time it's slowed right down to this incredibly dirgy, sludgy crawl. And yeah, it's a reprise of that riff that we've heard, or a sort of reprise of that riff that we've heard on a lot of the album. But I think it's brilliant on this one, though. I love how slow it is. I just love slow, doomy music. And as well, behind all that brutal bass and drums, you're just getting this constant fuzz from one of the guitars, and it sounds so much like what you'd hear from Norman Westberg on something like Cop, for example. It's interesting actually, having discovered, talked about the Swans albums, and I can kind of see their influence on something like this now. It's kind of cool. But yeah, Sodom and Gomorrah, noisy, chaotic, indulgent. At 18 minutes though, we're going to be stuck here for a while in this existential chaos, so there's not really one you can actually do except just lose yourself within that noisy Gnod miasma. I love how this one progresses though. It's, like I mentioned, it's so sludgy and noisy though, like it just pummels you, and then I think it's around after 6 minutes it starts going back into that sort of like drone section, as you get these really sort of peculiar vocals, and it sounds almost like Gregorian chanting. I don't think it is, but it just sounds like that, sort of like, you know, kind of stuff. It's so cool. And for me though, like, you know, especially with that sort of like chanting and howling and droning of the vocals, it sort of further explores that quasi-religious aspect that I mentioned earlier. You know, it gives it all this really uncomfortable spiritual existentialism that makes me feel so very out of place with my very existence, if that makes any sense at all. However, the track doesn't stop there though. The drones, the vocals, the deluge of noisy fudge though, it all comes back in and builds up to this massively tumultuous level, you know, it overloading you with pure noise as we're thrown back into that motoric drum structure once again. And it paves the way for the phenomenal closing of both this track and the whole album, basically. The rhythm section slowly comes back in, maybe arguably a little bit slower at times, and I don't know if I can work it out, but whatever. But it screeches out with such presence and volume, climbing far above the instrumentals. And what's so satisfying here, though, is the constant refrain of your spinal fluid, which Paddy just holds on to and drones out vocally though. It's one of my favourite bits in any Gnod song though. I just love that refrain. I love how it sounds, and you know, how it comes in after rhythm section, you know, you get the drums going boom, boom, and then he just howls out your spinal fluid as you get this chaotic deluge of noise from all the instruments just building up and up, and then back into that boom, boom with the drums again. It's so cool. And yeah, for me, like, you know, I find it also so existential but so absurdly satisfying. And it for me, it as well, it really sort of makes sense with the whole build-up of this album, you know, starting with the mirror into Learn to Forgive, and then building up into this colossal 18-minute track of Sodom and Gomorrah. I think it's brilliant though. It makes it re-cement itself as one of my favourite Gnod albums. It's full of noise, riffs, drones, and, you know, existential musings, you know. It's brilliant stuff. And so with that, we've essentially covered one of my favourite Gnod albums. And you know, I have wanted to cover Gnod for quite some time on this channel now, as they're a band that really changed a lot of my outlook on the kinds of music I would start to explore at the time. You know, when it was I discovered them, it was when the band had released, you know, probably one of their most monumental and chaotic albums of Just Say No to the Right-Wing Capitalist Fatalist Industrial Death Machine, which sort of took garage rock to this really satisfying doomy place. And after hearing that and falling in love with it, I went and checked out the whole discography, and I found myself really attaching myself to the mirror here. You know, it's a very slow, sludgy psyche-doom notions just really communicated itself with me, and thus it became one of my favourite albums of theirs, you know. So yeah, if you like noisy, chaotic, sludge psych, then definitely check this one out, as it's one of the most satisfying, indulgent albums I'd argue. It's so good. Before we close off, a little bit I want to discuss about the mirror though, a little bit more here. On your vinyl editions, you do just get the mirror and Learn to Forgive on side A, and then Sodom and Gomorrah takes up the entirety of side B. However, if like myself you purchase the CD version, or even the digital version available on the band's Bandcamp page, you get given the bonus track of The Mirror Rakes Parade Remix, which is a remix by a friend of the band, Andy Blundell. And this kind of sort of acts like a reprise of the album's opening track, you know, further pushing it into that swirling, murky miasma of confusing, you know, chaos and stuff. It makes it very unusual, but what I like actually is how a lot of the instrumental albums on the original track, you know, sort of been brought more to the forefront on this one. It makes it a much more interesting listening experience within its own right, I'd argue. But of course, just to be a bit contrarian, I do prefer the album ending on Sodom and Gomorrah though, like, especially with the build-up of the first 2 tracks and the build-up you get in Sodom and Gomorrah. I think it's a perfect way to end the album, and I kind of feel like including, the remix on the disc version is a bit of a moot point, but maybe that's just me being a bit fussy, whatever. But yeah, like, with that, I think we've going to be coming to the end of today's episode of Weird Music. I'm glad to have taken the time to talk about the crazy eclectic world of Gnod, but to be completely honest with you, this video doesn't even begin to start scratching the surface of the weird music this band has made, as their vast discography covers such monumental ground, with each and every release, I would say. But I figured I wanted to talk about Gnod, so why not start with one of my favourites, of course. Great way to get Gnod into the weird music mix, right? No doubt though, we're going to have to talk about some other Gnod records though, as a lot of their recordings have been so absurdly influential on the music we do in Bird and Limbs. And I'm very aware of the colossal album The Infinity Machines being an absolute favourite of our band leader Chad, so maybe we'll dive into that weird album one day, maybe. In any case though, I hope you've enjoyed watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye!